Today on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, we have an absolutely wonderful conversation with Dr. Patrick Deneen, professor, philosopher out of Notre Dame, the author of Why Liberalism Failed, and also of The Odyssey of Political Theory, a wonderful little book. We're going to talk with him about the great books and why he loves them, and also why everyone should read Homer. We also have on the podcast today Dr. Chad Pecknold, an Augustinian scholar out of the Catholic University of America. And he's going to join us today, too, as we talk about the theological implications of reading the great books. Overall, we're going to talk about why should we read the Odyssey. Now, if you don't know anything about the Odyssey, I'm just going to give you a fair warning that there are a few spoilers. If you just know absolutely nothing about the text, there are a few spoilers, but overall this is a wonderful introduction to why we read Homer and why we read the Odyssey. So join us for a wonderful conversation. Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. You can find us on social media and also thegreatbookspodcast.com. We're continuing our year of Homer, having worked through the Iliad and now working into the Odyssey. Today we have some very special guests with us today. So we have Dr. Patrick Deneen, is a professor of political science at Notre Dame. He is the author of many books and articles, including Why Liberalism Failed and also Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future. His teaching and writing interests focus on history of political thought, American political thought, liberalism, conservatism, and constitutionalism. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We also have Dr. Chad Pecknold, Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at the Catholic University of America. In political theology, Pecknold is principally concerned with close readings of Augustine's masterwork, The City of God, as a fundamental and transcendent vision that inspires and has the power to critique and correct the dynamics of Western civilization. I thought that was a wonderful line out of your bio on the COA page. So
Terrific.
I stole that. It was
Terrific.
wonderful. Yes. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And then we also have Dr. Richard Meloche, who's been on our podcast before. So president of the Alcuin Institute for Catholic Culture, a ministry of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa, and a colleague of mine here at the Chancery. So welcome.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen. So today we're discussing the great books, Homer, the Odyssey, all things in between. So, Dr. Dean, one thing I think that's interesting, I was looking at your biography, is that you actually hold a BA in English, right? So usually we think of you as like, you know, the political philosopher. When I think of you, it's very intimately always tied to why liberalism failed, because that was like my introduction to a lot of your thought. But who is Deneen? The lover of literature? Like, what led you to go into a BA in English?
Well, I remain a lover of literature in spite of my calling now as a political philosopher. And at the time I was going through both undergraduate and then graduate school, this was a time, we could say, the beginning of the collapse of the study of literature in the American academic institutions. I was in, as an undergraduate, I was at a school, Rutgers University, where Foucault, Derrida, deconstruction, postmodernism was making massive and very quick inroads into the study of literature. So that was really, at the time I was studying. So I saw it kind of happening, unfolding in real time. And I wanted to study literature. I wanted to study, the great books. I wanted to study the masterworks of literature and to think about the ways in which literature teaches us about the human condition, about the condition of human beings in relationship to the transcendent, the kind of space that's philosophic while also drawing on the human reservoirs for imagination and storytelling, character, plot, tragedy, comedy, etc. And what I discovered increasingly, especially wanting to go on to study literature in graduate school, was that I couldn't do that in a department of literature. I couldn't do that in a department of English, which had been my original plan. And during that time, I was beginning to take courses in political theory with one professor at Rutgers who would teach a lot of literature in his classes. And he taught it in exactly the way that I thought literature should be taught, which is that these great texts have something to teach us, and we ought to approach them with a kind of humility and a sense of openness to what it is they have to teach us, rather than with the kind of hubris of thinking we know more than Shakespeare, for example, which I think is the postmodern approach. And this was how I kind of gravitated into political philosophy. And my first, my dissertation and then my first book was on the Odyssey. It was precisely doing what I'd hoped to do in a department of literature, but which I ended up doing in a department of political philosophy. So that's how I kind of went over to the dark side, as it were.
Yeah, no, very good. Now, did you have a love for like the great books coming into your undergraduate, or were you being exposed to it at the same time it's being kind of deconstructed and taken away from you, or did you bring a love already to the table?
Very much so. So I guess maybe this is the time to make a confession, since I'm in the Chancery, which as a high school student, I was voracious, unusually voracious maybe as a reader. But the figure that I became quite fixated by or on in the latter part of my high school years was Ayn Rand. Which is not, I think, atypical of high school students. You kind of read Atlas Shrugged or Fountainhead, and you read about people who want to do great things. They're ambitious. They hope to make transform the world, and they also are kind of rebellious. During those years of beginning to pull away from your parents and your home. But it's funny because Ayn Rand would often talk critically about figures such as Plato and Aristotle in her writings. And so I thought, in order to really understand Ayn Rand, I should really read some Plato and Aristotle, which I did.
Okay.
I thought I should go to the sources. And I came away from those encounters thinking Plato and Aristotle are way better than Ayn Rand. So this cured me of my Randism before I ever entered school. But I do have to credit Ayn Rand with inadvertently making me much more of a Platonist and ultimately an Aristotelian.
No, that's wonderful. So I think if memory serves, I'm constantly usually posting on Twitter about what I'm reading for our great books curriculums or what I'm reading to my children, right? So my children are still relatively young, so I'm trying to habituate them to some kind of, these kind of great books for kids, if you will. And if I remember correctly, I posted a picture of Dulaire's Greek mythology and like Norse mythology collections. I think I remember you commenting on. Did you love those as a kid?
I loved those books.
Really?
I read. In fact, I could tell you almost verbatim some of those stories, the way in which they present them. I can remember the illustrations are just burned in my mind. The stories. That was, for me, that was my introduction to Greek sort of thought or Greek philosophy was through those myths. And I think that's why I actually went into the study of literature initially, was because of those. And why I ended up ultimately writing my first book, my dissertation on the Odyssey, was because of those, the kind of those formative texts and stories from my own childhood.
It's just amazing to me how many people I know who have credited those books. So if you're unfamiliar, Dulaire's, he has this introduction kind of the Greek mythology, which I think like all the illustrations are that like a colored pencil, it's just a wonderful depiction, right? And he also has the Norse mythology, which I actually really enjoy. I've read both to my children.
Yeah, both the books are great.
It is, and it's amazing how many people credit that to kind of awakening their imagination, right, to those mythologies. I think, Richard, your wife, who I know is very into like great books for kids and does a lot of reading with them, I think she was the one that introduced me to those texts, and I just fell in love with them.
Yeah, they're a staple in the household too. Yeah. My kids love them and read them all the time.
It's the Norse mythology one that my son William, who's now a classics major at UVA, decided he was going to teach himself Old Norse.
Really?
Yeah.
And did he?
He sort of. He was like 10, so he taught himself.
He made a good faith effort.
And that's also what led him to learn Latin and Greek and prioritize learning Latin and Greek.
I really like these stories because it gives me a lot of hope that I'm reading these to my children, right, and actually cultivating their imagination, right, in the proper way. So, Dr. Pecknold, what about you? So we talked about Dr. Deneen's kind of exposure to the great books. Where did you kind of in your intellectual history come into understanding the great texts?
Yeah, it's interesting. My early education, my high school education, was taught by liberals in Seattle who thought the bee's knees was modern existentialism. And so, I studied, Jean-Paul Sartre. I didn't read any ancients. The closest I got to reading ancients was thinking about the myth of Sisyphus, So I think my first encounter with the ancients was by picking up this little volume at a used bookstore. edited by the great Vernon Bourke, called The Essential Augustine. And I just read and reread this little book, The Essential Augustine, and it's a little bit different than going to Plato through Ayn Rand, but but in a way, that's what happened.
Is in both cases, it's take and read.
That's right. That's right. The tale lege of reading Augustine led me to, well, I have to know Plato now. Right. I have to know Cicero. Because, in the Essential Augustine were these nice long selections from the City of God, which appeared to be very much a conversation with Cicero. So I better go read Cicero. And so I think that this is actually just, the medievals have this phrase, manuduction, being led by the hand. And that's how education works with a teacher. A teacher leads you by the hand. But there's also a kind of serendipity or providence that leads you by the hand through Felix Culpa of Ayn Rand, or the kind of way in which I got introduced to people like Plato and Cicero through a great saint.
What was it? I mean, now looking back on that moment, because now you are, a scholar of St. Augustine. That's where you spend your time in your study.
Yeah, I really never left the Augustine page,
like what was it? Was there any moment, sentence, something that actually just, became that splinter in the back of your mind that just never left you?
In terms of going back to the classics, or
just in terms of
what
reading,
kept me into Augustine?
What got you into Augustine? I mean, you were sitting here reading these existentialists. You pick up Augustine. What about that actually stuck with you?
I think that's a really interesting question in terms of the existentialists, because I think one of the key problems that the existentialists want modern man to face is that there's no meaning, that your existence rather has no extrinsic meaning, that the meaning of your life is the meaning that you give to it. And I think in Augustine, I discovered for the first time, and wanted to discover, because I knew somehow it was true, but my teachers weren't teaching it to me. I wanted to know that meaning was something that was extrinsic to myself, that wasn't something I was making up. And Augustine, every word of Augustine just pulsates with that sense that our nature must be conformed to something greater than ourselves. We're not masters of nature, but we actually have to conform ourselves to reality. And the only way in which we can find meaning is by giving ourselves to that, those eternal truths that can, in a sense, free us.
Yeah, I think it's interesting looking back as you guys reflect how providence will take things and use it to open you up to the truth. Because I grew up Protestant, went to a little Protestant school, definitely not great books based, right? Yeah. Everything is very new. Sometimes we read C.S. Lewis, like that was our dive into the intellectual deep end, right, was C.S. Lewis. And then I remember our headmaster at the time did some kind of seniors honors course, whatever. He wanted to introduce us to Christian philosophy. And I took it for, I don't even know what reason, providentially now. And I remember we read Kierkegaard. And I was just enthralled. Yeah. Like the questions he was asking, like, it made me really think about, like, wait, what do I actually believe? And that was like the moment that I really started thinking. I think that's actually what awoke an intellectual life in me, right? It's like, oh, what is this text? Right now, I have no idea, right? You're talking about like reading Ayn Rand, and you go back to Plato, right? I'm reading Kierkegaard. I have really no understanding of where he is in the greater conversation of texts or anything like that. But I think it's just interesting ways how you can look back and say, what did Providence use to actually like wake this up inside of me, right? Richard, what about you? What about like the great books? Like, where were you kind of introduced to that?
I think for myself, it's the complete opposite of you all. It's very much not bookish at all. So I spent my youth up in Canada and very much a coureur de bois, right? Just running in the woods and really had a disdain for any kind of intellectual life completely. And it really wasn't until I was introduced in my undergrad formation to the thought of St. Thomas and kind of the philosophic act and the possibility that the intellect can actually be converted to truth and can grasp truth and understand it. Had some wonderful Thomistic teachers, and that kind of helped me move beyond relativism, intellectual and cultural relativism. And for me, then, the return to the great books after coming at it through the Philosophic Act was teaching and beginning to teach now philosophy and theology, and realizing that the students had a very difficult task of moving through a logical argument. And so they needed to be schooled or formed or introduced to truth from a kind of a side angle, not directly through philosophy, but indirectly through narrative. And so going back and trying to become a better teacher and realizing for a lot of modern students, it's best to address these really deep philosophical questions. Who am I? Where am I ordered to? What is my final end? What constitutes a good life? Not through a direct philosophical argument, but rather through narrative. And these great books and the good books in general do a wonderful job of kind of opening the students up to these questions through a narrative.
No, very good. Any other thoughts on just our preliminary introduction to how we were exposed to the great books?
I mean, one thing that I'll say is that I learned from Augustine, and this kind of connects with Patrick's now classic essay against the great books, is that Augustine thinks there's a lot of books that we might think are great, which he thinks are vicious.
Starting with Ayn Rand.
Well, he didn't know Ayn Rand yet, but
Oh,
he would have
recognized her.
He would have recognized her, but that Augustine's withering critiques of great classic works, and that awakened me, I think, intuitively to the idea that texts aren't just magical on their own. That you actually need a framework for approaching texts, for understanding what makes a text great. And what makes a text great is the truth. And if a text isn't speaking the truth, if it's somehow deceiving people, as he often thought about certain Platonists were tricksters. They were deceiving people. And they were very popular texts. Manny, a very popular thinker, was a kind of, great figure, but was vicious. And so to take, the critical thinking requires a framework oriented towards truth, and making those discernments between what's true and false, I think, became, for me, the Augustinian desiderata. Like, that's how you determine whether a text is great or not. Is it orienting you to truth, or is it somehow deceiving you, or putting, grave idols before your mind?
No, that's very good. That's very good. So, Dr. Dean, your PhD dissertation in political science uses Homer's Odyssey as a narrative to explore politics, which later became a book entitled The Odyssey of Political Theory. So we have it here for our people who can see it. We'll put it up like there. And I also noticed, do I have this correct? It won the Leo Strauss Award for Best Dissertation in Political Theory.
Yes, it did. Now, that doesn't mean it was Straussian, although
I was saying, my
Strauss,
first reaction to that is that I need to go back and reread what I read for all the missing esoteric messages that I missed when I read it through.
It's interesting. The American Political Science Association, which one wonders this is still the case, the award, the name of the prize it gives for the best dissertation in political philosophy is named for Leo Strauss, although I think it's probably been decades since they've awarded it to somebody who was influenced by Strauss.
Okay. So just like in general, like what actually led you to use Homer's Odyssey in your PhD thesis in political science? So you talked about, you had this background. You already mentioned that, your love of literature continued, right? Your love of the great books continued as you went through that program. So when you come to actually write your PhD thesis, like, what actually led you to pick the Odyssey? Because I'm going to assume that this type of approach to a PhD thesis is unique.
Yeah, as I mentioned to you, political philosophy, the discipline of political philosophy, has had a lot of people who study literary texts. In fact, there's an organized section in the Political Science Association on literature, on the study of literature, and I traveled in those circles and spoke to people in those circles. And also, if we just to invoke the name of Strauss again, even where the texts are often not literary texts, the way in which those texts are read often call on and indeed demand the kind of literary interpretive skills of somebody who studies literature. And so there's actually an awful lot of overlap between how one reads texts in political philosophy, Rousseau or Plato or Machiavelli. particularly if one's influenced in that Straussian tradition, and how one would read a literary text, looking for allusions, looking for symbols, looking for the teaching that might be below the surface, the way in which there's artfulness and craft to writing. So it doesn't seem to me to be, it never seemed to me to be all that so different, studying a literary text versus a kind of more nonfiction or philosophic text, certain kinds of texts at least.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. My introduction to the great books actually was very much in a context of Leo Strauss, who I was also being introduced to at the same time. So it was interesting because my first introduction to Leo Strauss was actually as a very attentive reader of the great text. It was only later that I actually kind of realized like all this political philosophy and et cetera.
Philosophical apparatus. So I mean, I think one of the things that Strauss, to his great and eternal credit, was to introduce something that now seems obvious, I think, or should be obvious, which is that it's impossible to read the dialogues of Plato without at some level reading them as literary texts. In other words, to read them as dramas and to see that they have characters and settings and they have particular dynamics that are taking place. And this might seem in some ways obvious to us now, or at least to some of us, but if you look at the kind of tradition of the way in which Plato was interpreted until Strauss, an awful lot of it was basically just trying to extract the philosophical meaning without any attention to the kind of the dramatic dynamics within the text itself.
Yeah, those seem very flat after reading Strauss.
Absolutely.
Right, very flat. Did you have like a particular love for the Odyssey that you were wanting to incorporate into your PhD thesis, or did you have your thesis and you're looking to fit it into a great book? Like, how did that actually develop?
Well, I think part of our conversation here today is how serendipitous these things can be. When I finished undergraduate school, I actually I spent a year at the University of Chicago with the intention of studying with Alan Bloom, speaking of Strauss.
Okay.
And I was in the Committee on Social Thought, which was kind of interdisciplinary. I thought I could be literary and do my literature studies and study philosophy and so forth. And one of the courses being offered, very typical University of Chicago fashion, was an entire year-long course on the Odyssey, which was offered by the great classicist David Green. You may have heard of Green's name if you have the old University of Chicago collection of dramas translated by Green and Lattimore.
Okay,
Lattimore and Green. That's that Green.
Okay.
David Green. What a classic kind of character out of another age. He was an Irish classicist who had a farm not too far outside of Chicago. He would come into his classes having worked the farm all day with boots covered in cow dung and then just start reading in Greek.
Wonderful.
And we would just have this very slow read of the Odyssey in the original language for an entire year. And that leaves an impression on a person. That leaves
I'm
a
sure
mark.
it does.
And when I left Chicago to go then do to focus on political philosophy as the discipline I wanted to, for the reasons I already said, I was reading what's the typical canonical introduction to political philosophy, in which you read the kind of canonical texts, starting with Plato and Aristotle and Augustine, Aquinas, Cicero, and so forth. And after having gone through that year-long course on the Odyssey, it's no surprise that I saw the Odyssey everywhere. I saw the Odyssey constantly appearing and reappearing in these texts, starting obviously with Plato, which constitutes one of the chapters of this book. And I began to think, this is kind of interesting to track through the appearance and reappearance of the Odyssey or Odysseus in the works of political philosophy. And what does that mean? And I thought this might make it for an interesting project, not only just because it seemed like a project, but because it interested me.
It's interesting, that juxtaposition that you talk about with Green, about having kind of that deep intellectual life, but then also coupling it with whatever you want to call that, a rural life.
Yeah.
It's funny because that's actually very, I don't know if I want to say it's popular, but I want to say like that's a template that is actually being replayed out here in Oklahoma. I think even like the Alcuin Institute, so if I can, pick on you, Richard, for a moment, right, as president of the Alcuin Institute. But that's actually very similar to the way that you've structured your life, right? So you come in, you teach, you're talking about the great books,
I
et
try to
cetera.
get the dung off my feet.
Right, we'd make you take your boots off outside.
It's more impressive if you leave them on.
Right. Just come in raw, right, to the class. But then at the same time, like, you're living on 5 acres, you have your cows, you also raise baby doll sheep, you've got chickens, you've also got some kids running around, right? What is it that, particularly in that juxtaposition, do you see that is either beneficial, or you actually find to be a very natural coupling between that kind of like rural life and this also life of the mind?
Yeah, I think there is a natural link between the two. Principally, I think, if you want to have a robust intellectual life, have, a life of the mind in which you are cultivating these higher habits, these higher speculative habits of knowing and understanding and sapiential gaze of reality and so forth and so on. In order to do that, and obviously have a rightly ordered will, a life of virtue as well, the imagination, I think, is an essential component of that integrated life. And so you need to be able to form the imagination very intentionally. And of course, I think, as you mentioned, I think it's very popular today because in past generations, that imaginative formation was somewhat natural, right? The individuals had immediate contact with the real, quite naturally. But today's technological world, there's a gap. And as a consequence, I think people are intentionally trying to form the imaginations, or in order for them to be more intentional with the cultivation of the higher speculative and volitional habits that constitutes traditionally what it means to live a good life. So I think there is that natural coupling, which is unique in today, specifically because of the technological age that we're dwelling in.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's very good. So also from someone who lives on 5 acres, I only have chickens though. Well, I also have children, but I have some chickens, right? So, but it is interesting though, just actually being able to, even like with my role, so I don't get to teach all day. I do our legal, insurance, HR, and Chinese protection all day, right? But actually to go home and, have that time working outside actually as a decompression, and actually it's amazing how many thoughts and how many things will come just out there engaging that. And then that's sort of life I've tried to give my children too, of actually being out there and actually engaging, I think what you would call, the real. Dr. Pecknold, the Odyssey. Do you have any particular love for it? Do you remember when you read it? Like, is it a book that sticks out to you at all?
No.
Did you take a year-long class?
No, I
with a
did
farmer
not.
Professor?
No, I did
Okay.
not. And my son, I wish my son was here because he's a great student of the Odyssey, but I only know it through the texts that I read. I've never sat down and read through the Odyssey.
Mm-hmm.
I've read the parts that get cited, but it's something I'm ashamed to say that I've never sat down and read through the Odyssey.
Is a lot of that coming through the Aeneid from doesn't Augustine pull heavily from Virgil?
I mean, I was going to say Augustine's much more indebted to Virgil,
right?
And though Homer does come up occasionally, Augustine famously comments that he hates the Greek language.
So you're just channeling that inner Augustine.
You know, it's funny because whenever you say Alcuin, I think Charlemagne.
Mm-hmm.
And Alcuin is tasked by Charlemagne to build this incredible educational system, both outside the court and in the court. And one of the things that I love in Einhard's life of Charlemagne is this legend, and I think it's true, which is that Charlemagne had Alcuin read the City of God to him every night at dinner.
Really?
Uh-huh. And that while some kings might have had the Odyssey read to them, since it's a great sort of narrative, sort of oral tradition, right? The Odyssey comes to us through oral tradition. That in a way, the City of God is kind of the Christian king's Odyssey. It takes you through history. It takes you through what matters and orients you to what is true. And of course, Odysseus is also yearning for home, and he's yearning in some sense for the City of God.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that it seems to me that in many ways the way in which I talk about this a bit in the book, in the introduction, the way in which subsequent books shape and reshape the tradition. It's I think it's impossible for someone who's grown up in a Christian or even somewhat post-Christian society not, in some senses, to hear Augustine on the pages of the Odyssey.
Yeah.
because it is a book about restlessness and the longing for home and what it is to be at home for a human being.
Yeah.
So obviously it's not a Christian text.
No,
and yet
but
it's such a precursor, a kind of anticipatory.
That's a good segue into this, like, how do we look at the canon of the great books, right? So a lot of times people think, oh, the great books, you might think of that, what is that, the 1952 series, right, Great Books of the Western World, and it's like, this is them, right? They're on my mantle, like, here you go. So can you say a little bit about that of, you had a good line in the book, you say, every writer creates his own precursors. And you talk now about, now you can't really read the Odyssey without seeing Augustine, if you've done that. Can you talk a little bit about the canon of great books? Where does that come from, and this dynamic that later writers can affect the canon itself?
Yeah, so that line actually is really just, it's a riff on a classic essay by T.S. Eliot on the concept of tradition. And that tradition is itself a kind of sedimentation, the constant building of, in a sense, the addition of new works, the addition of new practices or new ideas, but that it always has, in some ways, has to find its place of settlement among the existing. And it doesn't leave the existing unchanged, because each thing that's added then has this kind of resonance to the things that preceded it. And so in exactly the way that the City of God, kind of once you have that as part of the tradition, it reshapes the way in which we see its predecessors. And things that may not have leapt out of the page, or in this case, in the oral tradition, leapt out of one's mouth, now suddenly have a kind of salience as a consequence of something that has taken place later. So it's a very organic idea of tradition as opposed to a very static idea of tradition. It always bothers me when you get these, this is what the canon is, and we're going to we're going to print it in these volumes, and this will it's an effort to capture something that really is ultimately inescapable at some level.
But there's always a carrying up, right? Like the Virgil's carrying up Homer, and Augustine's carrying up Homer and Virgil. The Catholic faith also does this in a way which is constantly perfecting and purifying the tradition.
Yeah, and I see that. I think it's a wonderful insight that you're offering here, because one, it just seems like a natural observation of what's actually happening historically, as these texts actually develop. Because typically, I think a lot of people have a knee-jerk reaction when you talk about a change in a canon or a developing canon, that's a negative, right? It's like, well, that means we're not going to read Homer anymore. We're going to read some terrible text that just came out 2 years ago, right? And so what I like about this is it just seems very much to be pointing out that the canon is flexible, that there seems to be an inherent intelligence to that dynamic about how this actually happens.
I would add another element, which is that in some ways to become a part of that tradition, or to become, to produce a work or write a symphony, whatever it is that's going to become part of the canon, in some ways it has to be deeply rooted in that tradition and in that canon. And for this reason, it can't be sort of astroturfed onto a tradition. It has to again sort of arise organically from developments within that tradition. And this is where, again, I find the idea of this, let's just throw in a bunch of, today in a kind of effort to have diversity and multiculturalism, we're going to add these authors to the canon in this particular class and so forth. Well, then you have people that are no longer speaking to each other and no longer building on the insights and thoughts of predecessors. And so you kind of disturb or you destroy that dynamic. That's, I think, one of the wonderful things about when students discover, they're reading Augustine and they see, oh my gosh, here he's quoting or he's riffing on Plato, or you read Aquinas and you see these authors being invoked, that you undo what should become a sort of natural, sort of the wonder of discovery, that now I'm in a sense participating in the creation of this tradition, and reading them and seeing and reconstructing these appearances and reappearances.
And another kind of element on this too is the fact that often these great books, this entire canon, again, they're not static, but also they're kind of interpreted within a school, within a grouping, right? So even Patrick, what you brought up in regards to the professor who taught you the Odyssey, right? I mean, a lot of the way in which you read that text is dependent upon the way in which it's taught to you, right? The guide who is leading you through the text and the influence that that teacher has on the student of the text itself. So there's a fact that these texts are meant to be read and conversed and discussed within a context of friendship, teacher and student, or a group of colleagues reading it and learning from the text as a group. So that's an important kind of organic element of these great texts as well.
Or
often
teacher
is
and
forgotten.
king, sometimes.
Exactly, teacher or king. Yeah.
Alcuin and Charlemagne.
Yeah, it occurs to me too that maybe just a really simple example of this is, Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, and post Aquinas, how that changed the canon and the attention that Christendom then gives to Aristotle, right? And so that's a natural dynamic that you actually see occurring in that process. Why do you think Homer is such a lightning rod? Like when we talk about where read the great books, should we read the great books? It just seems like there's so many debates that come down to Homer and why should we read him? Like, do we read him just because he's accidental to history and other people think he's important? Does he have any kind of inherent value in reading Homer? Like, if people ask you, like, why do we read Homer? Like, how would you answer that?
I guess the question would then be, why do we read anything? I don't know. We read Homer because in many ways, so in the first instance, he's at the beginning of the Western tradition. He inaugurates many of the themes that become central to the West's own self-understanding. And I'm not saying that there isn't a kind of universality to many of these themes. I'm sure there is, but the particular valence or gloss that I think you find in Homer are ones that I think are at the foundations of the Western tradition. And I think here's, in a sense, the beginning of that process of the discovery of how the tradition itself is built upon the voices that precede others. A really good instance of this is, for example, in Aristotle, the name we just were invoking. Aristotle, who often cites and quotes and invokes Homer. There's a line in Aristotle in his Politics, which runs along the following lines. That creature that is incapable of living in a city is either a beast or a god. Now, what does that mean? Like so much of Aristotle, it's a kind of great sentence that it's just dropped in there and then he doesn't really elaborate on what it means. Here, I think this is more or less a kind of direct invocation of the lesson of the Odyssey.
Really?
Yeah, I think this is one of the central dynamics of why we continue to revisit the Odyssey, which is the Odyssey is the effort to find out what it is to be a human, and what we understand to be a human is that creature that is neither a beast nor a god. And if you think about the dynamics of the Odyssey, it's Odysseus traveling to all these, fantastical places that maybe no person has ever seen, except on the New Jersey Turnpike, maybe.
I thought I saw an Cyclops once.
The Cyclops, I did see the Cyclops. But Cyclops is a really good example. What he encounters on the journey home is almost the complete absence of human beings. He encounters beasts and gods. And the constant question that's being placed before him, or dilemma, is, will he find a home there? Is this the place where he can settle? Is it to be the human lot to be among the beasts? And it's tempting, right? To take the lotus is one good example, which is to kind of almost to become like a beast, to become like whenever I come home from work, my dog is just so happy to see me, or if I feed my dog food every night, the dog is super happy that what is it? Oh my gosh, it's dry dog food again. So happy about the dog food. Imagine a blissful existence in which you don't have any worries and any cares. Everything's always good, wagging my tail. That's a really tempting pole. And then there's the pole of being a god, which is, you could say it's a couple of different things. First of all, it's not to have to worry about death, all right? That constant gnawing anxiety that we have as human beings. Odysseus is offered immortality by Calypso. Sorry, spoiler alert. And the question of what he does is really an interesting, question. He's offered the cover of my book I'm looking at right now. He's offered the knowledge of all that happens above and below and on the earth by the sirens, suggesting a kind of the knowledge of the gods. And he's tempted by it, and only because he's been forewarned to tie himself to the mast does he not throw himself overboard to pursue that knowledge. The Odyssey is kind of a book about what it is to be a human, and it is to kind of navigate, not just literally to go home, but to navigate between the temptations of being a beast and a god, at least as it was understood in that time, and that it turns out that to be a human being is to live in a city. It's to return to Ithaca, as imperfect, as violent, as filled with unsavory characters as that is. That's what it is to be a human. And so when you read that line by Aristotle, that creature that's incapable of living in a city is either a beast or a god. If you don't have the Odyssey rattling around in your brain, you're not going to understand that line, and therefore you're not going to understand the politics of Aristotle, which means then you're not going to understand, at some level, you're not going to understand Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
So I would say let's start there with just one little sentence, and we can move on.
No, I appreciate that. I think that kind of unpacks a little bit of what we're trying to do on this podcast is introduce people to the great books and kind of get them used to, if you want to call it the great conversation or et cetera. But so many people, just jump in somewhere in the timeline, right? Which I think, it sounds like a lot of us did as younger men. And then you just start realizing like, oh, there's someone behind this and there's someone behind this. Doesn't seem to be a whole lot behind Homer.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're going to pick a starting place, this seems to be, when this actually tradition starts. Yeah. Do you think, when you look at the Odyssey, you have this beautiful coming home story, right? Which obviously I think is a main aspect that you've incorporated into the text that you wrote. You also have this dynamic of a father and son relationship, right? This fatherlessness. And also on the other side with the son, you have a coming of age story, I think, right? So you have these kind of like beautiful themes that I think you can pull out. But Odysseus himself, so maybe I'll play my cards and then everyone can tell me how wrong I am. So when I first read the Odyssey, it was actually a really frustrating experience for me. So I read it in a group and everyone was just saying like, oh, he's amazing, right? Like he's enduring all these things, et cetera. And I saw him as an incredibly, I guess, conflicted character. That's probably a positive way to say what I saw, right? Without getting into like spoilers, but like, sometimes I feel like using his men as a sacrifice, right, to endure. So he escapes, but it's at the sake of his men, and he's a leader, right? He's not like one person amongst many. Like, how do you navigate that with all? It just seems like Homer has stacked all of these different themes, but even Odysseus himself just seems to be an incredibly conflicting character. That like anytime you bring up like, oh, is he a good man? Is he a bad man? It seems like very blood on the floor conversation. So if you could solve that for us, I would appreciate it.
I don't know that I can solve it. So, I mean, I guess maybe the kindest I can be about Odysseus is that he is an imperfect character, or like all of us. He has his definite weaknesses and his proclivities. And it comes out. I mean, he is someone who is foolhardy. You're right. I mean, he turns out to be at least a dubiously. Could one even say he's a successful leader? Well, he returns home with none of his men. Right. So by that measure, not terribly successful. He makes a lot of bad decisions in the course of his journey home. Now, he also makes some decisions which I think are also praiseworthy. I mentioned before the decision not to accept immortality from Calypso. And that, again, a spoiler alert, but that decision, as far as I know, we were talking about D'Aulaires' Greek mythology, one of the things that book seems to be a particular good example of is how often human beings, men in particular, are offered immortality by women. And how often, to use the phrase of art, how often they're buggered as a result of it. That there's no human being that we know that gets offered immortality and accepts it and doesn't end up in a really, just bad situation.
Right.
Usually, just destroyed by Zeus
Cursed.
or something. Cursed, yeah. And in fact, for readers who are looking for this, the very beginning of Book 5, which is the first book where we actually encounter Odysseus. We've heard about him. Books 1 through 4 are called the Telemachia. They're about Telemachus, his son, and the situation in Ithaca. Book 5 begins with Odysseus, who we've been hearing about. And it begins by breaking the normal, the kind of standard line with which almost every chapter begins, Dawn spread her rosy fingers is the typical way. You'll see this almost the beginning of every book. It's a new day. Dawn is spreading her rosy fingers. Beginning of book 5 begins, Dawn rose from the bedside of haughty Tithonus, and then ... Now, you'd have to know who Tithonus is. Now, if you've read D'Aulaire's book of Greek mythology, you will know who Tithonus is. Tithonus is offered immortality by Dawn, by Eos. And he accepts, and Eos then goes to Zeus and says, I'd like to marry this mortal. And Zeus said, okay, I grant your wish. I will give him immortal life. He will never die. Now, you remember what happens? She forgets to ask for eternal youth.
Oh.
So he continues to age until he becomes a grasshopper.
Yes, I remember this now because the imagery,
smaller
the illustration
and
there is wonderful. That's what kept.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He becomes smaller and more, sort of bent over until finally he's indistinguishable from a grasshopper. So it's really a great line. Dawn rose from the bedside of haughty Tithonus. Right, he thinks he's got immortality in his pocket, and then we move to Odysseus on the side of the island, weeping to go home, because for 7 years he's been wanting to go home. And we learn that Calypso is offering him immortality every day. Just stay with me and you will never die. And he turns this down in order to leave the island and return home. I can forgive Odysseus, in a sense, almost every other bad decision he makes, because he makes, in some ways, the hardest decision, which is the decision to turn down at least a kind of false immortality that's offered to him by Calypso. So I think, in many ways, a lot of his bad decisions are a result of, in an interesting way, of the good decision that he makes, of the decision in which he is going to throw his lot fundamentally down with being a human being. And then to be a human being means you make a lot of dumb decisions.
Right.
You make a lot of stupid choices. And he could have avoided that fate, maybe. Or at least he thinks he might have been able to avoid that fate. But I think by being a human, you accept the limitations of what it is to be human. So I'll give him that much.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful. Dr. Pecknold, do you see any connection, or what connection do you see here between all these offerings of immortality and you will be like a god, and these things that we see maybe in an obscure way in the Greek myths? And I just keep thinking of Adam and Eve. I keep thinking of Eve's conversation with the serpent.
I mean, what leaps to mind is, this is going to be another lateral move, but Beowulf was written in a sense with this idea in mind that you can create a non-Christian myth that has all this kind of Christian resonance. And it's very clear that this is the case with Homer, with Virgil. These are attempts to struggle with the reality of what it means to be human. And whenever we struggle with the reality of what it means to be human, we're going to come up with the same sorts of narratives that the Bible gives us revealed access to. Access to our fallenness, an understanding of our brokenness, and evidence of our original sin. And I also think of how Augustine treats the history of Rome, and the fact that he reads the fratricide out of which Rome is born, the fratricide between where Romulus kills Remus, as a Cain and Abel story. And the way in which the Catholic mind is at a distinct advantage over every other kind of human being for reading these narratives correctly. Reading the narrative history correctly, reading Homer correctly, reading Beowulf correctly. That the Catholic mind is able to, in a sense, read the human story at a great advantage because we have divine revelation.
Thinking, so since you brought up Beowulf, I don't know why. Oh, I have another thing of beautiful children's books. I have an illustrated children's book on Beowulf, the children's book, and I think you
Is that
have
the one you recommended as well?
Yeah, I think you have the same one. I've been reading it to my kids, which is wonderful because now my toddler's talking about doing things with his bare hands, right? That's what he got from it. I was like,
That's awesome.
I didn't tell my wife, and then she was like, our toddler keeps talking about his bare hands. And I was like, yes, because Beowulf rips Grendel's arm off with his bare hand. Like, it never dawned on him my hands could be a weapon, right? So he's like, he's very much enjoying that. But it just dawned on me as I was contemplating this story, because I love that story. I think it's wonderful. Is one of the most touching kind of moments in that story, because you talk about it being a pagan story and kind of has this like Christian gloss on it. Yeah, is the narrator takes a moment. I'm going by memory here, so forgive me, but the narrator takes a moment back, and because Christendom now has only come to them in like the 700s or something like that, somewhere in there. If we can take a rough number, and so he gives this moment where he's like, I hope there can be a harrowing of hell for our people, and it just. So basically what he's saying is Christianity has just now come to us. I'm thinking of all of my ancestors, right, that we honor. And there's this beautiful moment in which he actually has this prayer in which it's very short, but I think very powerful, in which he basically says, I hope there can be some kind of harrowing of hell for our people, right? That Christ would go down and preach the gospel now that we know it, to all of our ancestors. Yeah. I just think it's just a very powerful, rich part of that text.
Because God has come down in the very flesh into human history, our Catholic faith can go deep into Homer, into Virgil, into Beowulf, and it can pull up. It has this hydraulic power, and it carries up the truths and purifies and washes away the errors.
There's also kind of an inherent danger, too, as readers of these classic texts, that are after the advent of Christ, right? Now, all of a sudden, we're reading these characters, and we're looking at them through a Christian lens and saying, Odysseus is a failure. He's a vicious man. He's not living up to the Christian ideals. Instead of understanding him as this pagan individual who's imperfect, who doesn't have the grace of Christ and his church. So there's that inherent danger of reading these texts through that principal Christian lens as well, not understanding them in their own historical context, both as individuals but also as fictional characters developed by these great poets.
But our faith also has a good anthropology, right? So that we can actually look at Odysseus and say, well, he's got these virtues and he's got these vices.
But this is one of the ways we were talking earlier about when you approach the great books, you need a frame.
You need a framework.
And if we don't have a frame, then we're seeing in some ways the particularity maybe. That's what the Greeks had to say, that's what the Romans had to say, that's what the Christians had to say, that's what the post-Christians had to say, that's what the Nietzscheans have to say. And then you're left with kind of basically a kind of relativism.
It's like a pluralistic jangle.
Everyone just has a different view, and either you come away with it saying there's no truth, which means you're default a Nietzschean, or you say you just have to pick a truth. You just have to...
what's your favorite?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's I'm afraid that's too often the approach of the great books. Yeah. And with the Christian lens, I think you can see the ways in which you can see how aspects, for example, of the Odyssey are anticipatory. We talked about the kind of restlessness, the desire for home, what it is to be that no home maybe can provide the final satisfaction, and that's part of the interesting thing about the Odyssey is that once Odysseus reaches the goal, which is to go home, it's not clear he's going to want to stay there because he has a restless heart. But I think we can also see the ways in which that world is, to echo Richard, is not a Christian world. And there are two ways in which this is the case. First, it's a world in which to be cruel is in some ways the sign of a kind of heroism. To be vicious in some ways, to be cruel, sometimes wantonly cruel. And maybe the scene that's most disturbing in the Odyssey is when Odysseus punishes the serving women who have betrayed his home by sleeping with the suitors who've been cruelly using up his property and abusing his family. And he gratuitously and cruelly strings them up and kills them. In a way in which it seems to be kind of, the poem seems to suggest this is normal and somehow vaguely admirable. There's another dimension. I actually just taught the Odyssey last semester, and this is something my students, even if there weren't, most of them Catholic, all of them at some level, of course, ultimately affected by a Christian world, which is the world of the Odyssey is a world in which it's very dubious whether one has, in some way, some sense, in the deepest sense, a kind of free choice. And I praised Odysseus for making a choice, but there's a way in which, in the Greek, certainly the sort of pagan Greek worldview, the choices you make are always constrained in some ways by this mysteriousness of your character. And the source of one's character is a mystery, right? So that one makes a choice, but the choice seems to be constrained by the kind of character that you have. Now, Odysseus seems to have more choice than most because he's described in the opening lines, the first sentence of the book, as polytropos, Odysseus of many ways or many turnings. He's the most unusual of the Greeks because he seems to have the ability to make more choices. But almost everyone is constrained by a kind of lack of liberty, a lack of freedom, because it's a world in which everything is more or less fated. Everything is fated, and one inescapably makes the choice that fate sort of demands of one. And I think that's for a Christian, that's a world in which that's, I think, rightly unrecognizable to us.
Yeah, you see that almost in a comical way at times when you're reading the Iliad, right? That just like
exactly
the fickle gods and just incredibly capricious and who's winning. It's funny in that one, like to be a good soldier at times is to read these patterns of the divine, right? So we're sitting there clashing and all of a sudden something happens and you'll see one soldier stand up and be like, hey, Zeus's favor has swung. We now need to retreat, right? And just how much, I think that's one of the perennial questions that Homer raises is what is the relationship between the acts of men and the divine?
I do think it's, in some ways, though, it's also this is something I was emphasizing with my students last semester, was it's helpful to read Homer because he's also a kind of corrective to a world in which we think everything is the result of choice, that our choice is completely unconstrained. And how much of what we think of as our free choice is itself constrained by our own characters and by the fates or by our situations that are in some ways not chosen by us. So somehow between the world of no choice or extremely little choice in the Homeric world and a world of seeming endless, open choice of the modern liberal regime, maybe there's some deeper sort of synthesis between these that I think is also a reflection of a kind of Christian worldview in which we do have a kind of choice, but it's a choice that's always, in some ways, it's in a world that's given. We don't make it. It's a world in which those choices, to get back to farming, right? A world in which, I can't decide tomorrow that my cow is going to be a pig.
Yeah, there are natural measures and standards in place.
Now, I know I just offended all the transhumanists.
That's fine. You can do that here. That is perfectly fine. So kind of moving more towards a conclusion, I am curious, Dr. Pecknold, about where you see the role of the great books for theologians, for a theological study. Why if I just want to go read Thomas Aquinas, why should I take the time to also be conversant with this great books tradition?
It's interesting because in theological education, it is not any kind of scripted part of curriculum that seminarians might read great books as part of their pre-theology in a course of philosophical training, but it's not something that is dictated by the Holy See that we go and read great books. But I think this is a lacunae in theological education, is that basically what happens is you pick and choose. If you're reading a lot of Augustine, here's the classic text you go and read. And I think it would behoove us to actually think as Catholics about having the places in which we can have the time and the leisure to read through classics precisely with a Catholic worldview, precisely with the Catholic framework, and have those conversations as you do. It's I think, unfortunately, in theological education, all too rare to have the kind of luxury, of a year or 2 years of study of Homer or something like that. That just doesn't happen. Someone might choose to do that on their own. They might, in their pre-theological studies, study Plato or Aristotle, but it's not systematic. And so programs like this, where you can actually have the leisure to take the time, then when you look at the theological text, it becomes even brighter.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. And for me, some of that seems very alien because, I went to graduate work at Ave Maria University, and I went there as a Protestant. And so my first semester there, I'm in. I very much confused Ave Maria on why I was coming because there was only 4 of us, and like one's a Dominican sister, and the other 2 guys are hardcore Catholics, and then I was coming from Oral Roberts University, which probably could not be any more different. So if you talk about Providence, I have a lot to look back on and be very thankful for how. Yeah, I mean, I literally found Ave by Googling because Catholics were very theoretical. I didn't really have like a lot of actual Catholics in my life to help form that decision. Yeah. So I remember sitting at a coffee shop with Father Matthew Lamb.
Oh, yeah, the great Matthew Lamb.
Yes, and I don't know who he is. And I'm sitting there trying to talk him into letting me into the program. I was like, I can do this. And I would love to have a conversation on tape because I have no idea what came out of my mouth. And probably everything I said was wrong, but God be praised, he allowed me in the program. And as I was mentioning kind of before the podcast, that master's program at that time had your typical, it was a 2-year, 64 credit hour master's that had its systematic side, as you would expect, but then kind of tethered to it was this great book sequence. And so I came in, I remember like now all of a sudden reading all these texts, like I very much needed Thomas Aquinas at that point, coming from a charismatic background. I needed that faith and reason. That was what kind of drew me to Catholicism. But at the same time being like, okay, now we're going to read Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
And like, so for me, the coming to the faith and seeing and reading Aquinas and reading all these things is also like intricately tied to also reading Plato and Dante and Boethius and these kind of texts. And then seeing the moderns, right, as this ongoing like rejection. And it's something that I'm very indebted to the Diocese of Tulsa through the Alcuin Institute that we have done this with our diaconate program, right? So our deacons, deacon candidates that are going through our program that we run here through the Alcuin Institute, yes, they're getting their systematic theology, but also then they start off with also a great book sequence. And so we're going to start off reading Homer, and that's their first year, is actually mainly just working through Homer. And it is amazing to me how much that, I think, enriches and flavors the overall, conversation.
Can I add a historical writer to that, which is Augustine's great De Doctrina Christiana on Christian teaching, which isn't quite the classics, but it's the beginnings of the medieval university, because on Christian teaching, he basically unpacks the importance of the liberal arts for reading Scripture. And that when you tie the liberal arts to the Holy Scriptures and then also to the preaching of the Word, that on Christian teaching requires this kind of education in order to communicate the gospel. It's really powerful when you start to think about that as the basic blueprint of the medieval university, that we study these things ordered to an end, and that end is God.
Right. Yeah, I think very much, as I approach the Iliad, as we approach the Odyssey, I think as we've mentioned here, being able to see all things through the lens of Jesus Christ, being able to take the incarnation seriously, right? That this actually happened in the fullness of time. And God used, I think, the Greeks and the Hebrews clearly to then cultivate the soil for the coming, of his son. Then yes, I think that when you look at these questions on free will in Homer, I don't find them accidental, right? I find them to be watching Providence really start to cultivate the world to understand Jesus Christ and understand. So they might seem comical at first of like, oh, look what Zeus did again. And Zeus himself is, very comical. But at the same time, it is raising these perennial questions of like, wait, what is the relationship between the actions of men and the divine? Like, what is that? And then by the time you get to Aquinas, this is an incredibly mature, incredibly in-depth conversation, but it starts in a lot of ways, in this battle for Troy, right? So as we kind of close out, Dr. Deneen, thank you for all of your thoughts. Deeply appreciate your insights, lots to think about. Any kind of like final word advice for people approaching the Odyssey?
Well, I hope, as a few of my comments suggested, we don't know really anything about Homer. There's a lot of legends about Homer. We don't even know if there was a Homer. There's theories that this book was compiled by, a whole bunch of different poets. Whoever did this, though, was a master craftsman, because there are so many little telling details in this book that I think, as your comments just pointed to, open up worlds. They open up just dimensions. And it's easy to get sort of wrapped up in the stories, but be a careful and close reader of this text. When the poet departs from the formula and mentions, for example, haughty Tithonus, make sure you do your research. Who was Tithonus, and what does this have to do with the story? So I think, and again, to echo, I think agree with my friend Chad Pecknold. It's preparatory not only to understanding maybe this Greek world, but it's preparatory to being a good reader, and a good reader, perhaps finally, ultimately, with an end to being a good reader of Scripture, a good reader of the world, and thereby come to knowledge, to know, to love, and to serve the Lord.
No, very wonderful. Richard, Dr. Pecknold, any closing thoughts?
Amen.
That's beautiful.
Hallelujah. We are good. All right. Well, you can check out more on thegreatbookspodcast.com. We'll post things there. We'll have our show notes. We'll post the link to Dr. Deneen's book. We also, actually, you mentioned it briefly, the Against Great Books article.
Yeah, terrific
That's
article.
actually a wonderful, counterintuitive title, but a wonderful little article in First Things by Dr. Deneen that I think came out right after I got out of grad school. And so I very much received it right after going through a Great Books program. So we'll link that as well, and we'll continue through our year with Homer. So thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.